Hello, Chris Green here with the Flood Insurance Guru. If you've got questions about flood insurance, flood education, flood zone changes, elevation certificates, click below to visit our website, floodinsuranceguru.com. You can also check out our daily flood education videos on our YouTube channel. Remember, we have an educational background on flood mitigation, which means we can help you understand flood risks like this right here, your flood insurance, and mitigating your property long term to help you minimize flood losses and flood premiums. Today we're here on the Buford River, and what we're talking about is what is the difference between shaded X, or also known as X500 flood zones, and just X zones. So today we're going to talk about those differences. So let's talk about the difference today. What is a flood zone X?
Today we're talking about what is a flood zone X and how does it impact you? Well, flood zone X is an area of minimal flooding risk that the government has not determined the exact probability of. However, with flood zone X, the flood insurance is not going to be mandatory and they're not going to be in special flood zone hazard areas, which means they're required. However, almost up to 30% of flooding at this moment occurs in flood zone X. Take Houston, for example. Most of Houston was in a flood zone X. And the reason why it's not mandatory is you can't really determine the risk. If you have a hurricane coming inland, it drops 40 inches of rain, everything's in a high risk flood zone at that point. And so that's one of the reasons why flood zone X is considered minimal risk. Also, whenever you get a flood zone change from a high risk to a low risk, the zone they're generally changing it to, if it is a low risk zone, is going to be a flood zone X.
So now let's talk about what is a shaded flood zone X. Today we're talking about what is flood zone shaded X. How is it different from a flood zone X? How is it different from an A or AE? What's the true risk here? Well, let's talk about shaded X. Shaded X is considered a moderate risk. Now, remember, flood zone X is a low risk. A and AE are considered high risk. So shaded X, if you're looking at the requirement, you're still not going to be required to carry flood insurance if you're in a shaded X. But the reason shaded X is usually in an area is because it's usually around like a levee system, a dam. And what's happened is that area has been accredited. And because of that, even though it's a little bit of an elevated risk, it's still that preferred risk there because the local community has done things to minimize the risk behind that levee or behind that dam. So that's what a shaded X is. You see, one of the things these two things have in common is they're both in that non-mandatory zone, or technically that minimum risk. Even though shaded X is more of a moderate risk because it's behind a dam, a levee, or something like that, they're still technically both in that non-mandatory zone, but it doesn't mean you don't need flood insurance. And so this is something you really want to pay attention to. This is also where some of your best flood insurance rates can be. So if you've got questions about what are your flood insurance options in these two zones, click below to visit our website, floodinsuranceguru.com. Remember, we have an educational background on flood mitigation, which means we're here to help you understand flood risks like this right here. Your flood insurance and mitigating your property long term to help you minimize flood losses and flood premiums. Thank you.